Depending on when you listen to this episode of the podcast, I hope you have or you had a happy Halloween. Also, of course, Thanksgiving on the horizon. It's great to be back in the Big Bit Theory Palatial Studios here in Austin, Texas. I'm your host, Bill Culhane. JW, the Jim Ward, will be along later to address your appetite for crazy bids that you can win. I mentioned Halloween and Thanksgiving just a moment ago. Of course, Veterans Day is coming up soon, at least in terms of when we put this episode together. We have a guest who specializes, meaning is heavily involved in topics affecting our veterans. Here at the show, and you know this if you've been a longtime listener to the podcast, well, we try to go beyond thank you for your service. Although, of course, that acknowledgement is wonderful, and for sure I know those in our military appreciate those kind words. Well, let me ask this. How is your business, or if you're on the public sector side, how is your agency helping our veterans? Lauren has her sweater on today. Temperatures have dipped here in Austin. And speaking of Austin, I was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina on Friday and Saturday, had an event over there. On Saturday night, heading back to Austin, our plane was taxiing. It was a rainy night there in Myrtle Beach. But anyway, we're taxiing out on the runway and hit, and this is according to the pilot who had the best view, the plane hit a fox or a coyote. We'll put that under notes from Bill's traveling escapades, adventures, whatever. And I don't know if any of you out there can top that story in terms of taxiing on an airplane. Dr. Jeff Wenger. Dr. Wenger is a senior policy researcher with the RAND Corporation. You may remember we had Dr. Colin Clark on, I guess it was last season. Dr. Colin Clark came on, also with the RAND Corporation, and Dr. Clark talked about terrorism. Well, Dr. Wenger is based in Santa Monica, California. Talk about a gorgeous area. Jeff has a PhD in policy analysis from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Tar Heel, and also a BA in mathematics from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And a quick trivia question, who knows Santa Cruz's mascot? If you said banana slugs, you would be correct. Among the projects in which he's involved, Jeff is one of the brilliant minds looking at the effects of working conditions on remaining in the labor force, and also the transitions of military personnel into the civilian labor force. In particular, the latter is, of course, important to us. We asked Jeff to come on and talk about what's being done for veterans and topical information on what our veterans, heck, all of us, need to know.
I just went through his biography, and Dr. Jeff Wenger does join us from out in California. And Dr. Wenger, in the lead up to our conversation, I mentioned how much we appreciate you sharing your expertise on issues impacting our veterans. And to kind of get things going, I guess the first question is, we're here in Austin. So how are things out west?
Well, up until recently, it was very, very hot in Los Angeles, untypically. So we just got done with the Dodgers playing in the second World Series game, and the heat has broken, and we're looking forward to another game tonight. That's the Astros. That's
right. The Dodgers, coincidentally enough, the Dodgers have left your part of the country and are now here in the Lone Star State, and it's obviously the first two games have been very exciting, and I guess we all expect that the rest of the series will be as well. But on an important note that is topical, I mentioned in the lead up to the podcast, this episode, that we are saluting veterans. This is a Veterans Day special episode, if you will. And folks who have been longtime listeners to the podcast know that I served proudly 9 years in the Air Force once upon a time. I don't want to age myself again. I would hope that everyone understands and appreciates all that veterans face while serving in our armed forces. And if you would, Jeff, what about after separating from the service? What are some challenges that veterans are faced with today?
Veterans are a really diverse group, and different veterans face different types of problems. So issues, many of them don't have problems at all, right? I mean, it's just they make a transition and it's all good to go, and that's probably the normal. But some of them do face issues. Depending on how long you've been in the service, Why you're leaving the service. If you retire, that's a different type of environment. You've served your 20 years and you're out. If you've done a shorter stint, 1 or 2 tours, then maybe you're having different issues. If you're an officer, you might have different issues than a person who's enlisted. So I think veterans, broadly speaking, are a diverse group of people. They come from a variety of backgrounds, and they face different issues depending on how long they served and who they are. Some of those issues include moving, relocating that final relocation, deciding what you want to do in terms of a career. Are you going to use your education benefits to go back to school? Is it going to be a university, or is it going to be a technical training that you're going to receive? Ultimately, what kind of job are you going to get, and how good a match are you going to be in that job? How satisfied are you going to be with what you're doing work-wise? So there are a whole bunch of issues that come about as a result of that transition out of the military.
I hear the words transition, and for most people leaving the military, I was one once upon a time. You're looking for that post-military career, and I'm happy to say, and Jeff, I know you're aware, there are a number of businesses across the country taking steps to help the military while in uniform and after discharge. And matter of fact, we at BitPrime, we have a number of clients, many folks listening to this podcast, who are involved in helping veterans. There are numerous business leaders listening to us right now, Jeff. What can they do to help veterans transition into the civilian workforce? I know that's a topic that you've done of research on.
It's a really good question, and I think firms, businesses, corporate America has done a good job of identifying and locating veterans and providing them opportunities for employment. And so there's been a big push after the surge in 2008-9 where corporate America really stepped up to the plate and tried to provide more opportunities for soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines to get jobs. Where I think they could do a better job is in mentoring some of these service members, matching them a little bit better to the types of work that would be suitable for their skills, and examining the longer-term prospects of turnover and job match. Those things are probably kind of flown under the radar, and they're harder to measure, right? It's easy to measure how many veterans did you hire, how many veterans are unemployed, but the sort of the quality of the match and the sort of long-term prospects, those take more of an investment and a little bit longer-term scope.
I mentioned we have business leaders listening to this podcast. Well, we also, of course, have veteran members of government agencies who are listening to the podcast as well. And I thought it was interesting how you talked about matching skills. And again, I can use my personal experience in the military. Well, I worked in nuclear surety and I worked in aerospace studies while I served 9 years in the Air Force. And it isn't, I know as a military member leaving the service, it's not always easy to make that apples to apples, oranges to oranges connection when you're out looking for a career. So while we know of many veterans who own small businesses and maybe they're putting their skills to use, if you're a business owner, let's say, the Jeff and Bill Company, what skills do military members have, of that would make veterans valuable to a business?
That's a great question. I get it a lot. It's really obvious if you talk to business owners about what they want. Dependability. Soldiers come to the workplace. They're great at time management. They work under pressure. They're great leaders. They work well in teams. And partly because this is everything that we expect people who serve in the armed forces to do. You always have to work with a team. You always have to communicate effectively with your leadership and the people that you're in charge of. So a strong sense of skills along those dimensions. There are a lot of soft skills built into those kinds of things, right? So it's hard to measure leadership. It's hard to measure time management. It's hard to know whether or not a person's going to work well under stress or under pressure.
Sure. But
we've trained soldiers and sailors to do these things. This is what, in part, military training does. It's the technical skills that often are the stumbling block, right? So if I have an IT position that requires a particular set of technical skills, the fact that I work well under time pressure and the fact that I work well with a team is really important. But if I don't have those technical skills, then I may be not offered the job. So it's a combination of the sort of soft skills, the leadership, the time management, working well under pressure, working in teams, coupled with building those technical skills that can do the job.
And I'll even throw out one more word, and I think it's important. I know it's important to everybody here at our business, but most of the people I interacted with, there was also a sense of loyalty. Now, of course, like everything, it's not 100%. I'm not inferring that everybody who comes out of the military has a sense of loyalty, but circles in which I traveled in the military, I got that sense as well. And I think everybody in business appreciates that.
Yeah, I think that there's the honor and integrity and loyalty are important attributes that are trained and are reinforced as part of service in the armed forces. Doing the right thing, working, and all the other thing I will say is working in culturally diverse environments. Right?
Good point.
That's something that's really important. You get deployed overseas, you have to have some understanding of the place in which you're going and the culture in which you're embedded. So I think there's lots of skills that we don't think about military members having, former veterans having, that are super valuable for today's business world.
A lot of people think about military skills transitioning to the private sector. Pilots come to mind, and you say, well, there's a pilot that's had multi-million-dollars worth of training. But again, I know in my experience, because of what I did in the military, not necessarily saying myself, but you look around and there are a lot of people in the military, veterans, who leave the service with, in some cases, millions of dollars worth of training that can be applied in the private sector. And we've talked about the private sector here, Jeff. What about governments? In our day jobs, we observe a multitude of government requests for veteran-related services, construction projects, consulting opportunities, grants. In your opinion, and you have the power of the microphone, Jeff, what should federal, state, and local governments be doing to help our veterans, and not just in the now, but also in the future as you look down the road? The private sector needs to step up to the plate. Well, what about the public sector?
The federal government's really taken the lead here, in particular the Department of Defense. So the way in which we transition soldiers out of the military into civilian life has changed a lot. We now offer, every soldier is expected to go through a transition assistance program. They have an independent plan that they're supposed to put in place for the transition. They get a week-long course that covers everything from how do I do a civilian budget, where are all my budget components, to how do I write a resume, how do I translate my skills to communicate what I've done in the military to civilian employers. So we've built in now what's called the Transition Assistance Program that everyone who's transitioning out of the military goes through. So that's one thing. Federal government's really kind of stepped up to the plate, DoD in particular. Second thing that we've done is we've made resources available online to soldiers and sailors, airmen and Marines to go in, look at the kinds of work that they did while they were in the military. So we call it a military occupational specialty. You have an occupation when you're in the armed forces. And how do the things that you did in the military translate to civilian jobs? The U.S. Department of Labor, in conjunction with the Department of Defense, has put together a series of online tools that will allow you to do some of that translation. So that's called My Next Move for Veterans. It's a website hosted by the U.S. Department of Labor, and that helps make that skills translation easier for people. So I think the federal, and then of course, for those who have a difficult time transitioning, and they leave the military and they're unemployed for some period of time, there's unemployment compensation for ex-service members. So we'll give you some temporary cash benefits to aid that transition so that you're not impoverished upon leaving, and give you a few months of benefits so that you can hopefully find a job and be successful. So I think the federal government really has, that program has been around for a while, but the TAP program, the My Next Move for Veterans, other online resources have really helped change the focus and facilitate the transition for service members.
For those listening to the podcast, Lauren and or Braden will include a few of those links that Jeff just mentioned, include those in the description of the podcast. And we encourage everyone listening who's eligible to avail yourself of that information. We do appreciate it. And speaking of information, Jeff, if anyone would like to follow up with you, how can you be reached, or are there any publications you have done that you would like to direct people towards?
Sure. Well, I can always be reached at the RAND Corporation. I have a public profile there. You can go and link to publications that I've written or look at other veteran transition publications as well. We've done quite a bit of work on this, so there are probably half a dozen publications or more that would be appropriate. I would like to say one last thing about the research agenda here, and it's important. We are in the process of developing a veterans panel, a survey where we permanently impanel a set of veterans and ask them questions about all kinds of things: their health, their well-being, their employment, their housing situation. And we're setting up that panel now in conjunction with the Society for Human Resource Management. They're facilitating this as well as with some corporate partners. And we'll be rolling that out in 2018 and have a large set of research questions that we'll be able to address that we haven't been able to look at before, and we'll be following the same veterans over time, over a long period, so we can sort of see how they're doing. And it's going to be really exciting, and I think we'll get some very interesting lessons out of what kinds of issues veterans are facing.
I'm a firm believer that information is power, and anything that any of us can do to help veterans, there's not a greater segment of our society, of our country, and they deserve our support. So, Dr. Wenger, we do appreciate you joining us here on the Big Bid Theory on behalf of our audience and everyone here at the show. Again, we thank you and all the best.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Again, thank you to Dr. Wenger. We found him, he found his way back. Jim Ward completed his circuitous route back from Burning Man finally, and that means crazy bids. Jim has, by the way, you'll want to hear this, check this out. Jim has a new sound effects technician, and we learned that JW is a neutralist. It's a word, he'll explain it. Jim on that and this crazy bids. Jim.
Crazy bids, crazy bids, crazy bids that you can win. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to this edition of Crazy Bids That You Can Win. My name is D. Jim Ward. Thank you, Bill, for that rousing introduction. I am the conductor of the Crazy Bids. I'm the person that brings you proof that the government will buy anything. This particular bid is right up. It's my bailiwick. It's conducting media monitoring on gender stereotypes, gender relations, and masculinities. It's put out by the United Nations Global Marketplace. So they needed help with masculinity. Well, where do you think they're turning? I'm surprised this thing isn't sole source, frankly. So let's get one thing straight right off the bat. Jim is a fan of the woman. I have a well-documented track record supporting my feminist bent. I know all of you who know me or have seen me see this superhero type of appearance, this beast Jim, if you will, full of toxic masculinity and whatnot. But the reality, it's quite the opposite. It's diametrically opposed to this perception. It's more like it's gentle Jim. You can ask any of my female acquaintances, and they will agree that I have fully supported. I supported the Susan B. Anthony dollar. I supported Geraldine Ferraro. So I am an extremely qualified gender neutralist. I think I may have just coined a new word there, Bill. Neutralists. Anyway, I am a gender neutralist. Hence, the point of this study is to find people like me. And frankly, I was thinking about this and talking with the staff. They could save a lot of money on this by just following me around, because I like to both shop and I don't mind a good scrap every now and again, just keep the blood flowing. I think what the UN needs is what they're looking for is how to not have, right now the big thing is in Hollywood, Harvey Weinstein, and before that Bill Cosby and so forth. I mean, it's a big deal. It's a problem. And it's being addressed at a snail's pace. So hopefully this study will help pick that up. This was issued on October 22nd and is due in November, November 5th. So any of you men who feel like you're in touch with your feminine side, throw your hat in the ring. Throw your Kentucky Derby hat in the ring if you wear one, if you're really feminist. The sad thing is, I think that whatever, Bill and I were talking about this, whatever they find out, whatever data they're able to cull and make some determinations on, the old guard, old white males, will never cede power without an epic struggle. There's a new book out. It's called The Da Vinci Code, which kind of discusses this. But that being said, we all here at TBBT thought this bid deserved its own crazy bid segment. There you have it. I'm probably going to bid on this, but I think every guy should that isn't a total meathead. And that makes like 5 of us, I think. In any event, thank you very much for all you returning listeners. This, once again, has been Crazy Bids That You Can Win. The bid, conducting media monitoring on gender stereotypes, relations, and masculinities. I can be it, but I can't say it.
I don't know what that means.
So, I am the Jim Ward. Thank you very much for listening to this edition's Crazy Bids.
Crazy Bids, Crazy Bids, Crazy Bids, Crazy Bids, Crazy Bids,
Crazy Bids. Oh my, I'm sorry for all of that. Bill, you guys in the studio, take it away. Thanks once again. Bye-bye.
Thanks again for that, Jim. Speaking of Thanksgiving, thank you so much for your continued support of the Big Bid Theory, and that includes you downloaders out there. My email is bculhane@bidprime.com. Jim is jward@bidprime.com. TBBT's Twitter handle is @TheBigBidTheory. I go by contract_hunter. JW is Jim Ward 6. That's Jim Ward, the number 6. By the way, Mark Z asked us to remind everyone you can also find the podcast. Head over to Facebook. Thank you to Dr. Jeff Wenger from the RAND Corporation again for the Jim Ward, our staff. Happy Veterans Day to all of those great Americans out there. Until we meet again, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
Oh, much fun. We're having so much fun.